audio part while we're doing our jumps every single time. That's your part to answer me when I sing the other part. 1, 2, here we go. Anusha has a best friend. Pizza, pizza, daddy-o. How do you know it? 'Cause she told me. Let's skip it, daddy-o. Good job. Brian has a best friend. How do you know it? 'Cause he told me. Let's punch it, daddy-o. Good job. Alex has a best friend. How do you know it? 'Cause she told me. Let's climb it, daddy-o. Good job. Arush has a best friend. How do you know it? 'Cause he told me. Let's kick it, daddy-o. All right, you're doing great. Let's try one more round. Ethan has a best friend. How do you know it? 'Cause he told me. Let's spin it, daddy-o. One of the things we're supposed to study in music class is comparing voices and listening for the differences that we hear. So let's review some of the voices that we are already familiar with. This gentleman looks like he would be using his what kind of voice? It's the kind of voice you use to answer a question in class or just have a conversation with your friend. It's your speaking voice. This gentleman's using what? That's right. He is using the voice that you would use if you were in class and you know the answer, but the teacher hasn't called on you yet. You are using your thinking voice. That's the voice that makes no sound, but you can hear yourself inside your head. What's this guy using? That's right. He's using his shouting voice. He might be at a game. He might be outside calling across the playground, but he is using his very, very loud shouting voice. This little girl is using her what kind of voice to tell her mom a secret? That's right, her whisper voice. That's awesome. That's right, she's using her whisper voice to tell her mom a secret. What about these folks? What are they using? Yes, they're using their singing voices. So maybe they look like they're in a choir. Maybe they're in music class or just at a choir class after school. Well, those are our 5 voices. Thanks for reviewing them with me. How do we tell those 5 voices apart? Because of the timbre of those different types of voices. Timbre is the character or quality of a musical sound that makes it distinct or different from others. So your whisper voice sounds different than your speaking voice because it's breathier. It is quieter, but it's also got more air. And then your speaking voice to your shouting voice sounds different because usually we would say that your shouting voice is brighter or more piercing, and it often raises in pitch as well. So we can think there are different kinds of voices and use timbre to describe them. But we can also use timbre to tell the difference between adults' voices and children's voices. Let's try that now. We're going to listen to an example. Then you're going to tell me if you think that example is a child's voice or an adult voice. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Was that an adult or a child singing? If you said An adult, you are correct. Let's try out the next one.
Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are.
Was that an adult or a child? Yeah, it was a child, and we know the difference because if we listen to the adult voice again.
Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are.
You could say that the adult voice was, and we're describing the timbre, we could say that it was maybe darker or deeper. We could say that it was richer. And then if we listen to the kid's voice again.
Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are.
We can say that the kid's voice was light. It was kind of sparkly, right? It had that light, airy sound, and it maybe just wasn't as dark or deep as the adult voice. So that's how we can compare them. Let's try out the next set.
Engine, engine number 9, going down Chicago line.
All right, let's listen to the comparison.
Engine, engine number 9, going down Chicago line.
Okay, which one was the adult and which one was the child? The first one was the child. Very good. And what about the second one? Yes, that was the adult voice. Very good. All right, now that we know what kind of timbre we're listening for, let's check out the next set.
Bee, bee, bumblebee, stung a bear upon his knee.
All right, let's listen to the next one.
Bee, bee, bumblebee, stung a bear upon his knee.
Okay, which one do you think was the child? The first one or the second one? And which one was the adult? Let's check our first one. That was the adult voice, the one that sounded like.
Bee, bee, bumblebee, stung a bear upon his knee.
It's high-pitched too, just like a kid's voice, but you can also hear that maybe it has a little more depth to it. It sounds a little darker, more resonant. That means that there's more vibrations to the voice. And then if we hear our kids' one, let's listen again.
Bee, bee, bumblebee, stung a bear upon his knee.
It's lighter, it's softer, but it's still very bright, right? So we can tell the difference. Let's check out the next one.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Once I caught a fish alive.
All right, let's check out the other example.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Once I caught a fish alive.
Okay, was the first one the child or the adult? Yes, it was the child's voice because it was lighter, it was brighter. And then our second one was the adult voice because it was a little lower and darker and deeper. Great job helping me figure that out. Now, texture is how many layers of sound we hear in our music that are interacting together. We might hear a solo, which is performed by just one person singing or one instrument playing with some accompaniment. Or we might hear a choir, which is a group of singers performing together. So now we're going to do the same thing, but we're listening. Do we hear one solo singer or do we hear a choir performing? Let's listen.
Dreams are made of this. Who am I to disagree? We travel the world and the 7 seas. Everybody's looking for something.
All right, did you think that was one singer or a choir? Let's listen to the other example so you can compare. Okay, was the first example a solo or a choir, or was the second example solo or choir? Here's the first one again.
Dreams are made of this. Who am I?
If you said that was a solo singer, you are correct. And then this one, we can hear in the texture that there are many voices singing together in a choir. Great job. Let's try another example. Okay, let's listen to the other example to compare. All right. Now, they are the same song, but did you notice which one was just one person singing and which one was a choir? That's right. The first one was our choir singing, and the second one was our solo singer. That was Coldplay. All right, let's check out our next examples. All right. Did you hear one voice or more than one voice in that one? Let's listen to the next one to compare.
And when she was lonely, I was there to comfort.
Okay, the first one, this one, was a choir. It had many voices. And then our second one was our solo singer, and that was When She Loved Me from Toy Story 4. Okay, we've got one more example. Let's check it out.
Through the storm, we reach the shore. We give it all, but I want more. And I'm waiting for you. With or without you. With or without you.
All right, so solo or choir? Let's compare it to this one. All right, what do you think? This was U2, with or without you. Our first one was the solo singer, that's right, and our second one was the choir. Really good job helping figure out the difference in adult versus kids' voices and the texture in choirs versus solo singers. Called There's a Hole in My Bucket, and maybe you know this song and you've sung it before. The interesting thing about this song is it's a circle song. Have you ever heard that song? This is the song that never ends. Yes, it goes on and on, my friends. Some people started singing it not knowing what it was, and they'll continue singing it forever just because this is the song that never ends. and the end of the song leads it back to the beginning. That's a circle song. Well, so is There's a Hole in My Bucket. It's also a circle song. You'll see exactly at the end what I mean. So as we are listening to, learning, and singing along with this song, we're going to follow through this book. And as we do, we're following the adventure of Liza and Georgie and this bucket. So keep an eye on this bucket right here and the worms inside as we go through the book. And if you have a good time with it, you can always rewind it and do it again because it's not a very long song. But the song has an interesting feel. Instead of feeling like a marching feel of 1, 2, 1, 2, it has a feel like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So whenever it's Georgie's time to sing, we are going to use a cup pattern, super simple, just to keep the beat along with him. And when it's Liza's turn to sing, we'll use a body percussion pattern. So let's go over both of those right now. The Georgie cup pattern is just going to look like this. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Can you get your cup and practice doing that with me? Tap, 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 bottom, tap, tap, down, tap, tap. The Liza pattern is going to look like this. Pat, clap, snap, pat, clap, snap. Can you try that with me? I know it might feel a little bit quick, and if you can't snap again, please don't worry about it. It's totally okay. Just make the motion so that we feel that beat. That's what's important, that we're feeling how this music is moving differently than some of the music we've listened to before or sung before. All right, well, let's try both of those patterns with some music before we get into the book. I'm going to keep my camera down like this so that we can see both patterns all at one time. Okay, let's give it a try with the music.
There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole.
Then fix it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Then fix it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, fix it.
With what shall I fix it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I fix it, dear Liza? With what?
With a straw, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With a straw, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, a straw.
The straw is too long, dear Liza, dear Liza. The straw is too long, dear Liza, too long.
Cut the straw then, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Cut the straw, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, cut it.
With what shall I cut it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I cut it, dear Liza? With what?
With a knife, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With a knife, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, a knife.
The knife is too blunt, dear Liza, dear Liza. The knife is too blunt, dear Liza, too blunt.
Wet the knife then, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Wet the knife then, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, wet it.
With what shall I wet it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I wet it, dear Liza? With what?
With a stone, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With a stone, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, a stone.
The stone is too dry, dear Liza, dear Liza. The stone is too dry, dear Liza, too dry.
Wet the stone then, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Wet the stone then, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, wet it.
With what shall I wet it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I wet it, dear Liza? With what?
With the water, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With the water, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, the water.
In what shall I get it, dear Liza, dear Liza? In what shall I get it, dear Liza? In what?
In the the bucket, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. In the bucket, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, the bucket.
But there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole.
Very good job helping me go through with the cut pattern and our body percussion pattern. Did you hear some words that maybe you weren't as familiar with? Well, I did. Whenever they said the knife was too blunt, what does that mean? Blunt. It means dull. It wasn't sharp enough to cut the straw. What about when she said, then wet it? Like make the knife wet? That doesn't make any sense. How's that going to help? Well, it's not the normal kind of like get your hair wet to wash it. It's W-H-E-T, wet, which means to sharpen a knife. So she's telling him to sharpen the knife. And she tells him to sharpen it on a stone, but the stone's too dry. Did you know, and I learned this when I had to learn how to make my own oboe reeds in music school, you have to have a stone be wet in order for it to sharpen a knife well when you slide the knife against it. Isn't that crazy? So then we sing the actual kind of like wet with water wet. But then what's the problem at the end whenever he doesn't know how to get the water because there's a what? There's a hole in the bucket. So it starts it all over again. And that's how the circle song works. Well, let's check out our song with the book now. And big challenge, see if with the book and the song you can keep doing your pattern. I would love to see if you can do it.
There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole.
Then fix it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Then fix it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, fix it.
With what shall I fix it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I fix it, dear Liza? With what?
With a straw, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With a straw, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, a straw.
The straw is too long, dear Liza, dear Liza. The straw is too long, dear Liza, too long.
Cut the straw then, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Cut the straw, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, cut it.
With what shall I cut it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I cut it, dear Liza? With what?
With a knife, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With a knife, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, a knife.
The knife is too blunt, dear Liza, dear Liza. The knife is too blunt, dear Liza, too blunt.
Wet the knife then, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Wet the knife then, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, wet it.
With what shall I wet it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I wet it, dear Liza? With what?
With a stone, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With a stone, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, a stone.
The stone is too dry, dear Liza, dear Liza. The stone is too dry, dear Liza, too dry.
Wet the stone then, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Wet the stone then, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, wet it.
With what shall I wet it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I wet it, dear Liza? With what?
With the water, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With the water, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, the water.
In what shall I get it, dear Liza, dear Liza? In what shall I get it, dear Liza? In what?
In the bucket, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. In the bucket, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, the bucket.
But there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole.